We continue our studies on the 12 apostles, or 12 disciples as we often refer to them. Today we meet Matthew, and if my mathematics are correct, then that will be the 8th disciple that we will have met. Matthew. We have very little biographical detail about him. We do know that he lived in Capernaum. The call of Matthew to be a disciple of Jesus is mentioned in Mark chapter 2, verse 14, Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, and Luke chapter 5, verses 27 to 28. From these few verses, we learn that Matthew was also called Levi. It was a common custom in the Middle East at the time of Jesus for men to have two names. Matthew's names mean a gift of God. The name Levi could have been given to him by Jesus. It is likely that James the Lesser, who was one of the 12 disciples we have already considered, was Matthew's brother. Although we know very little about Matthew personally, the outstanding fact about him is that he was a tax collector. Of all the nations in the world, the Jews were the most vigorous haters of tax collectors, particularly when it was one of their own race. To the devout Jew, God was the only one to whom it was right to pay tribute in taxes. To pay it to Caesar was to infringe on the rights of God. The tax collectors were hated not only on religious grounds, but because most of them were notoriously unjust. In the minds of many honest Jewish men, tax collectors were regarded as criminals. In New Testament times, they were classified with harlots, Gentiles, and sinners, a rather motley bunch. One writer describes them as a class of despised pariahs. That's certainly no compliment. Tax collectors had been known to assess duty payable at impossible sums and then offer to lend the money to travelers at a high rate of interest. One example of this kind of man was Matthew. The Old Authorized Version calls him a publican. This is a word that has changed its meaning in ordinary English usage. In the Gospels, it is derived from the Latin word publicanus, which meant a man who was engaged in public service, and especially a man who handled public money, and therefore was regarded as a tax collector. Matthew's customs office was located by the seashore in Capernaum, where he lived. His job was to stop people and demand to inspect their goods. It's no wonder he was hated by people. Yet, incredibly, Jesus chose him, a man who was hated by so many, and made him one of his disciples. Somehow Jesus was able to see the potential in this tax collector of Capernaum. It's staggering that as soon as Matthew heard the call of Jesus, he responded to it immediately. He didn't sit and ponder over the possibility. He simply, without any delay, left his booth, left his business, left his security, and he followed Jesus. Immediately he was freed from the guilt in his life that had built up over many years because of the way he had treated people so unjustly. Having sold himself to the highest bidder in the Roman Empire, he now gave himself up to the service of a king who was infinitely greater than Caesar. Instead of greedily counting his money, unjustly collected, of course, he would now experience spiritual wealth. It must have been a searching test for Matthew to leave behind his lucrative job and follow Jesus with no prospect of financial security. Jesus comes to all of us where we are. Whatever we are doing, and he invites us to follow him. Now, it may seem a rather basic question to ask members of a congregation like this, but I'll ask it anyway. Have you responded to Jesus' call to follow him? If not, you can begin to follow him today. No sooner had Matthew begun to follow Jesus than he became a generous host. Listen to these words in Luke chapter 5 and verse 29. Then Matthew held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. Matthew sought to tell his colleagues the good news about following Jesus. And even more than that, he gave them an opportunity to meet him. This transformed tax collector, this despised man in the community, prepared a great banquet. It was on a grand scale. He must have been a good cook. He held it at his own home, and he invited the only friends he had to share the banquet with him. That included his fellow tax collectors and other outcasts in society. It's very interesting that Matthew didn't turn his back on those he had worked with in the service of Rome. He could have easily done so. He could just have escaped their attention, got away from their company, but no, he chose not to. He wanted these people, his friends, to share his experience, to enter into his joy and follow the one who was now his master. There are some Christians who give up their non-Christian friends after they begin to follow Jesus. I've heard this testimony far too many times over the years. Someone will get up and tell about how they became a Christian, how they began to follow after Jesus, and they'll say something like this. I hate to hear it. When I became a Christian, I gave up my non-Christian friends. How sad. This goes contrary to the purpose of evangelism. When we follow after Jesus, we should be looking out for those who were our friends, and hopefully still are, and take the opportunity to share Jesus with them. Have you by any chance abandoned friendships that you used to have? Do you keep your faith in Jesus hidden from public notice? We must find novel ways to share with others what Jesus has done and is doing for us. I think the example here of Matthew is a very good one. He prepared a banquet. Well, we mightn't go that far, but providing hospitality in our homes is one way that we can use to share Jesus with others. We can invite them into our home. It's a wonderful way to be able to share our faith when we gather with our friends, our neighbors, around the table. Sharing a meal is a great experience for both us and those that we have invited. And it really is the perfect opportunity as we share together, partaking of food, to discuss what Jesus means to us. At the end of the service, we're going to sing those lines of Philip Doddridge in the hymn that he wrote, O Happy Day. He wrote, well may this glowing heart rejoice and tell its raptures all abroad. Matthew was unlike most of the other disciples, who were all fishermen. He could use a pen, and by his pen he became one of the first men to present to the world an account of the teachings of Jesus. It is clearly impossible to estimate the debt that Christianity owes to this despised tax collector. The average person would have thought it was impossible to reform Matthew. But to God, all things are possible. Matthew became the first man to write down the teachings of Jesus. He wrote the gospel that bears his name, Matthew's Gospel. He was a missionary of the gospel who laid down his life for his master. Matthew died as a martyr in Ethiopia. The apostolic symbol of Matthew is 3 money bags, which remind us that he was a tax collector before Jesus called him to be a disciple. I trust that each one of us, like Matthew, will hear the call of Jesus where we are today. But we will leave behind our past life and follow after him. Like Matthew, may we use the gift of hospitality to share our faith with our friends and neighbors so that they will follow Jesus too. Amen.